Today we are going to be doing a deep dive into SvelteKit and Supabase using this slightly above trivial app that I built out last week. We're going to be going over authentication, storage, API routes, loading data, all the different things that you would need to build an app with SvelteKit and Supabase. And yeah, we're going to be doing a deep dive into all of that. Now, the way this video is going to work is going to be a little different from a lot of tutorials you often see. Instead of going through and building the app out for you here and just going through page by page, okay, we're going to build this page, then this page. I've already built everything and I have the link to the code base down below. And instead, we're just going to be using the pre-built code base to go over and more explain the concepts. This is not going to be a beginner's tutorial on introduction to SvelteKit, introduction to web development, Node, all this stuff. We're really going to be diving deep into the more advanced and more edge case concepts of SvelteKit and Supabase and how these two work together. We're going to be talking about how authentication works. We're going to be talking about how layouts can interface in more complex ways with our SvelteKit apps. We're going to be talking about how we can handle storing things into storage buckets, how we can handle our Postgres migrations, how we can handle running an app like this and all the different runtimes and all that different stuff. So hopefully this is helpful for you guys. I'd love some feedback on this sort of format. If you would rather in the future for these types of videos, we went ahead and just wrote the code, then we can definitely do that. But I think for me, having the code and the app side by side really improves the sort of experience. And I think that there's a lot more to be learned there. So without further ado, let's start this off with a sort of term definition thing. So one of the most important things that we're going to be discussing in this whole deep dive is going to be the difference between the client and the server. I know for many of you this is remedial, but this is still something that I think really needs to be hammered home. The easiest way to put this is the client is anything that executes on the browser. Whenever you go to google.com and you hit inspect element, all that code, that is client side code. That is stuff that is sent to the end user and executes on their device. And server side code is anything that will run on the server that we host our website on. If we host on Vercel, anything that runs on those Vercel edge functions or those Vercel serverless functions or whatever it is, that's server side code. So it's really, really important, and we're going to talk about this a lot as we get deeper into this. It's super important to understand where your code is running, because with these new meta frameworks, with SvelteKit, Next 13, Nuxt, all these different frameworks, the line between the client and server is getting thinner and thinner every single day. But it's still there, and you still need to understand where things are running. You need to understand that your database is being called on the server, but getting sent to your front end. You need to understand a universal loader versus a server loader. All of these things are critical. I wanted to hammer that home before we really get into it, but with that out of the way, let's start this off with a discussion of SvelteKit. To begin, I want to talk about SvelteKit and specifically all of the different files that we're going to be using within this project. So if you look at just the side tree right here, you can see how many different file types we're dealing with, how many different files we're dealing with, and they all sort of look the same, and it can be kind of overwhelming if you're not really sure what's going on here. So I want to preface this with, we're going to go pretty deep into all of this, but there are going to be edge cases and certain weird things that I will probably miss. I highly recommend that you guys check out the documentation for SvelteKit. It is phenomenal, and especially the sections on routing and loading data. There's a lot of really, really valuable information in there, and it's super important to get a solid understanding and mental model of what's actually happening here. And while we'll go over it here, I definitely think that either before you watch this or after you watch this, the docs are absolutely worth giving a read. They're really great, and they will definitely help you learn this much, much better. So getting into the actual files here, the first one I want to talk about is going to be page.svelte. Page.svelte is just the client-side code for each page. Like I said, this utilizes file-based routing, and I think the simplest way to think of this is whenever you have a page, that's what gets sent to the end user. If we look at this right here within our root directory, so the root of our roots file, we have this page.svelte. In here, we have generate images, we have this image over here, all this stuff. And if we go over here, you can see that's the code that's getting sent to the user. We are at the root of our app, the file paths match. If we went to /testing, we would get the page.svelte from /testing, the two match. And really, this is just going to send down client-side code. This is just a Svelte file. Nothing too crazy here, but one thing that you'll likely notice is we have all this in here, but when we go to this page itself, there's this header up here, and if you noticed, there's no header in this HTML. Nowhere in here do I say dashboard or sign out. Nowhere in here are there any buttons. It's not here, and it's actually coming from the layout. So layout.svelte is another client-side piece of code that we can run, which will which is effectively something which will wrap all of the pages that are underneath of it, all of the pages and layouts that are underneath of it. So there's some tricky stuff here, and I have a good example which should help illustrate this. But to start, let's just look at it within the root. So within the root, we have this page.svelte and this layout.svelte. So think of this like a tree where we have our layout.svelte, but within our layout.svelte, we have this thing called a slot. And this slot right here is where where the page.svelte is going to be put in. So think of it like a wrapper. We're wrapping our page.svelte with this layout. So all this code right here, this header, all this stuff, this is going to happen right on top up here. So pretty simple, makes a lot of sense. It just wraps the page. But the thing is, this will wrap everything that's beneath it within the tree, within the file tree. So we look over here, we have this page.svelte is wrapping that. That makes sense. But if we go to, say, our dashboard page, again, if we look at our dashboard, no header in here. But if we go to our dashboard page, there's still a header. And that's because the layout will wrap everything in there. So everything beneath it will end up within that slot. But the thing is, it's recursive, and it will show in if you add another layout lower in the tree, the first layout, which is higher up, will wrap that second layout. So I have an example of that right here within this testing directory. If we go to this page.svelte, all we have right here is just you're logged in. It's just a little auth test. But the big thing is we have this layout.svelte. You can see I just printed out some blue text here that's nesting, and then I have this layout up here so that we should see a header, then the nesting, then this little auth check. And if we go to /testing, you see that right here. We get our nesting right here. We get you are logged in. You get that's my email. I should probably censor that. That's not my business. It's personal. So you can see right here, this is a really good example of the nesting, and this can happen infinitely. So getting that straight in your head is pretty tricky, but hopefully this sort of example helps you see what's really happening. And also one final thing you can see, if we inspect element right here, you can actually see if we expand this div, SvelteKit, the compiler, will put some comments in so that we can see what's actually going on. So you can see within this div right here, this is the page. Then this div right here, this is the first layout, then this is the second layout. So you can see sort of how that recursive structure is happening within the tree. We're gonna do a video on trees because I think that's a really underrated topic and something that you should all be very, very familiar with. So those are the two sort of client-side components, but then we have these special .ts files. We have this layout.server.ts, this page.server.ts, this layout.ts. What the heck are these? These are, I don't know what the best way to sort of call these is, but we're just going to call these the special TS files. And these are the places where we can load data or we can define actions that we can fire from our pages. The first one we're going to take a look at here is going to be this page.server.ts. When we look at this file, you can see right here, we're exporting this load function. Now, remember I said that these special TS files can either load some data for our pages, or they can serve as a place to put server-side actions or just actions that we call from our actual pages. So the first thing we have in here is this load function. All this load function is going to do is whenever the page.svelte is loaded, that it's in the same directory as, it's going to load some data and it's going to expose that data to our page. So you can see right here, we're just fetching some stuff from the server. We'll break down the actual code in here later, but for right now, just imagine it's loading some data. We're sending down a profile and some groups. We go into our page.svelte and we export let data. You can see right here, we have the profile in here and we have our groups. But we also have some extra stuff. We have this session and this Supabase. So where the heck are those coming from? Well, once again, we're going to have a bit of a discussion here about layouts. The layouts are definitely the most tricky part of all of this because they cascade down the tree. But if we go right here to our root and we start with the layout.server.ts, you can see in here, every once in a while VS Code does this. If you ever get that like squiggly line on here, just like create a line, then delete the line, then save it, and it goes away. I don't know why that happens. It's kind of weird and annoying. But anyways, we have this load function right here, which is going to return a session. So we're loading the session, which is great. And then we go into this layout.ts and then we get the session from above. So we get the session from our data and then we do this. But you're probably confused because wait, did we just chain those two? And we did. And the reason we were able to chain those is because one of these is a universal loader and one of these is a server loader. You'll notice that this has layout.server and this is just layout.ts. And this is a very, very critical distinction going all the way back to the beginning where remember I said client server distinction is very, very important. This is one of those cases. Layout.server will always execute on the server. The load function within this will execute on every single page server side whenever you make a get request to the page.svelte. Whenever we go to /testing, we are going to load this data on the server. But this layout.ts, this is what's called a universal loader. So this could execute on the client or on the server. It doesn't really matter. I don't know exactly how all of that works, and I really don't care. Really, the biggest thing is I just think of like effectively consider this to be run on the client, because if it can be run on the client, you need to think that it can always run on the client, because really you don't gain anything by going on the client. You just have to make sure that you're always using public variables and stuff like that. So consider this to always run on the client. And this layout.server will run first. So what we're doing is we're getting this session up here, and then we're using it within this load function, and then we're returning this Supabase in this session. So this load function is going to send down Supabase in session to every single file within our app. So you can see within this layout.svelte, we're consuming those two objects. We get our Supabase and our session, we're consuming them, great. But if we go down into this page.svelte within testing, you can see within data, we have session and Supabase. If we go into our page.svelte and dashboard, we have session in Supabase. So it will cascade throughout the entire app and will give us access to different things. We'll talk about why we're actually doing this and what we're actually doing in here within the authentication section. But for now, just think of these as loading data throughout the entire app. So that's the loading side of these special TS files, but there is also the action side. So remember I said you can load data, but you can also send data to the server to handle some action. And these are called, no, server actions is Next.js. I don't know exactly what they call them. I think they're form actions. Fact check me in the editing stage. But we go within our generate file. We have a good example of this. I have this action, so I'm defining our actions. And the action I'm defining right here is new. I'm creating a new, we're generating a new image. All you need to know is we are basically just generating a new image, and this is an action which we can call from the client-side code. So we can define actions and loaders within these special TS files, and that's one of my favorite parts of SvelteKit. One of the reasons why I find it so ergonomic to work with is because for the types of websites I build, and for I think the vast majority, unless it's just a super complicated dashboardy type app, it makes a lot of sense to, when I go to dashboard page, I'm going to fetch some data. You know, it's a dashboard, so I need to get all of my groups, and I need to get my profile information. So I fetch all that information and then I send it down to my page. Great. It just makes a lot of sense to me. And then if we need to do something, we need to define some sort of server-side action to handle that. We define it in here, we call it on the client, bam, it just works. So we'll break down the actual code on that. So that's all the stuff there. The final thing I want to call out is going to be this hooks.server.ts. This is something which will be run on every single request. Basically, all this is going to do is this is going to give us access to Supabase, and this is going to give us access to a little helper method called getSession. You just export this little handle function. Again, this is one of those places where I would direct you to the docs if you want to learn more. Oftentimes, you're not going to need this for a lot of things, and if you do need it, you'll probably use it for some third-party thing like Supabase, and they'll just have the boilerplate that you need in their docs. This is copy-pasted straight from the Supabase docs, and it just makes it pretty simple. The only thing we really had to do here to set this up was just go into this app.d.ts, and we just declare within our interface locals what Supabase and getSession are, so that whenever we go into our layout.server.ts, what we're doing is we're just calling getSession. So since we've already defined this within our locals, we can just call it right here, pull it out, and then set our session variable to be that. So super useful stuff right there. It gives us access to Supabase on the server and on every single request. And yeah, those are the sort of core components we're going to be talking about within Svelte today, and hopefully that helps. But again, read the docs. Next up, I want to introduce Supabase. Supabase is what we're going to be using as sort of the core of our backend here. We're going to be using it for authentication, for storage, and for our database. Now, Supabase is a lot better than I initially thought it was. I did a first impressions video of this a little bit ago, but the short of it is really, Supabase is, it's basically just an enterprise grade wrapper around Postgres, which gives you access to all the different things which you would probably end up building out yourself. When we look at this right here, and this is the local Supabase console, you can see I have my tables. You can see within here, I have my table editor, I've got my images, I've got my image groups, my profiles, I have my authentication where I can see all my users, I have my storage where you can see the generated images. I have this bucket with all of these images that we've generated. A lot of these are really cursed. It's OpenAI, it's the DALL-E wrapper. I didn't write the AI, it's not my fault. But it gives you access to everything you would really need for a full app. And I really, really like it. And the developer experience is excellent. So what we can do is we can go into our project and we can actually set up using the Supabase CLI a local version of our cloud Supabase project, and we can link those two together and we can get this really great development experience where we develop with a local Supabase instance and then deploy it to our cloud Supabase instance. So just know that we have this local Supabase instance. Now, I'm not going to go over the sort of way you get this set up because it's really, really easy, and this project actually already has it set up, so it's pretty simple, but I'll have a link down below. What you want to do is go to the Supabase CLI documentation, just read through all that stuff. Very simple. Basically, you just have to install the CLI, make sure you have Docker installed, and then you can just run the command and you get access to it. When I run Supabase status down here within my CLI, you can see I've got my API running, GraphQL running, all this different stuff is here, and I have access to everything I need to get Supabase running locally. So all that is really awesome, and that's what we're going to be using for our database, authentication, and storage. So now let's actually talk about how this is going to work. This is the diagram of the app that we're actually building. Now, I'll go ahead and I'll give you a quick tour of what this actually is. It's just a wrapper around DALL-E from OpenAI. There's really nothing special. This isn't a startup or anything real like that, but it's slightly above trivial and not quite just a to-do app, and I think it does a really good job of illustrating a lot of important concepts. So if we go in here to my dashboard, you can see all the images I've generated. I generated this guy right here, so a car driving across a beach. We have a beach, and I think that's supposed to be a car. It's not perfect, but it does a good job of illustrating the technical concepts. We can also go over here, generate a new group, and then basically let's just say a blue boat on a bridge. Let's see what it comes up with for that. It's probably going to be something really weird, but again, what this is doing is this is calling a bunch of server actions, is going ahead and generating it from OpenAI. It's going to save it into our local storage bucket and all that stuff. Really useful stuff. Really great way to illustrate these concepts. And then, yeah, we get our blue boat on a bridge. Nothing too crazy. So that's what we're building here. And now let's talk about the actual app structure. So the core of what we're doing here is we need to authenticate our users. Then once our users are authenticated, we need to let them actually do stuff within the app. And the stuff that they're going to be doing is going to be generating images, viewing images, and viewing a dashboard. So the way this is structured is we have our homepage. This would be anything public. So like if you had an about page, an FAQ page, all these different things, this would go over here in public land. They can access this without being authenticated or anything like that. Then we have this login page, which will activate a social login. In this case, we're using sign in with GitHub because it's easiest. I don't really like email password authentication. I know that there are a lot of people who do, but personally, I just find it to be really annoying. And whenever I'm building an app, I don't want to deal with your password. I'd much rather just use some social third-party provider. So that's what we're doing here. On the login page, you can sign in with GitHub, and then we're taken to this sort of fork in the road. So if you noticed within the database, we had that profiles table. So we need to have a profile to store information about our user and link everything up. So what we're doing is we're going to check if there's a profile in the DB. If there isn't, we'll take them to the /profile page, which is just where they create a profile. But if there is a profile, then we can send them over to dashboard. And we can do all of this using those server-side load functions because those will be executed every time we go to a page.svelte. So I'll show you all of that very soon here. Now let's get into the meat of this app and let's start talking about the database and where we control all this stuff. So what we're using here is we're using Postgres. Remember, Supabase is just built on top of Postgres, and it really is just Postgres. We need to define our migrations and our schemas somewhere. And what we can do is we can define all of that within the Supabase directory we're provided with here. So within this migrations folder, I can go ahead into this init.sql. And what this will do is this is where I will define the shape of my database. Since we're using Postgres, we need to do that. So what I did in here is I just went ahead and created my tables. These are very trivial, basic tables: first name, last name, email, all this stuff, going through creating my image group, this kind of thing. Pretty simple, but there is one sort of caveat to this. And if you notice right here, I'm saying user ID, which is a UUID. It's referencing auth.users. Now that's a little weird because that's a different schema than what we're looking at right here. So if we go to our Supabase dashboard in here and we go into our database, we can see we have our tables in here. Within our public schema, which is what we're defining within our migrations, we have image, image group, and profile. We just saw the schema for those. But when we click on this, you can see there are a hell of a lot more schemas that we have access to that are being run here. We have Auth, we have GraphQL, we have storage, we have all these different things because remember, Supabase is just Postgres. So we have all these different files, all these different schemas, and we want to reference a foreign key to our auth schema, because when we create a user using the social login and using Supabase auth, that will create an entry within the auth schema, and specifically within the users table. When we inspect this users table and you look at all these columns, we have this ID right here, which is a UUID. So what we're saying in here within our schema is that this user ID, this UUID, is referencing the auth.users table, which is super, super helpful. It's referencing that primary key in there. So that's how we're handling all that stuff. And you can even see within our table editor itself, if we look at our profile, you can see this user ID right here. We do a drop down on here, we edit this column. There is a foreign key relation. User ID is related to auth.users.id. So super, super cool stuff here. And all of this is incredibly powerful because it's just Postgres. And, I'm going to say that 50,000 times, but I hope you really do get that out of this. That's why I'm really using Supabase unironically, is because it's just Postgres. So we have this in here, we're defining these tables, but then there's some more stuff we're going to do down here. Right here, I'm saying alter table, profile, enable row level security, same thing with image group, same thing with image, etc. Now, why am I doing this? Supabase exposes a client-side SDK, which will allow us to query our database from the client. I personally don't really like building my apps that way because I think it makes a lot more sense to me to just use a backend server, which in this case is SvelteKit, and have those server actions and those server loaders. I think that just makes a lot more sense to me. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically just enabling row level security, but not giving any permissions to anybody. So we're just blocking off these tables. If I tried to make a request to the database from the client, it wouldn't allow anything to happen because we just turned on row level security, but we didn't define any different policies for it. So this is basically just locking down the tables. We could maybe do a video in the future on doing client-side database work, but I'm not a huge fan of it. It's not how I like to build stuff, but it's certainly something you can do. So that's what we're doing here. And then finally, we're creating our storage bucket. So again, remember, it's just Postgres. We're going to insert into our storage.buckets. If we go over here to our table editor and we look at our storage schema, within here, we have this buckets table right here, and we have this generated images. And this generated images is the thing that I created here within my migration. So we're just defining the ID is generated images, and then the name is generated images. If we go back over here, we can see within our storage generated images. That's how all that stuff is being linked together. And we go down here to create a security policy. And here I am actually going through and allowing some public access. So basically what I'm doing is I'm just saying that you can publicly write to this if basically saying that anyone can insert into the storage bucket if their bucket ID equals generated images. So I'm basically just letting anyone put stuff into the bucket, but you can only access stuff in the bucket if your user ID is the owner of the bucket. Because you can see within here, if we look at our table editor, we go into our storage, we go into our objects, we see right here the bucket ID on all these objects is this. You can see the owner ID right here is this A17D5665 type thing. If we look back to our authentication schema, that is going to be my user ID, A17D562, whatever, you get the point. So the reason why I'm able to see this image and pull it down is because I clear this policy. And there's a lot of nuance here and a lot of really special things you can do. I'll link the documentation for this down below. I'm not going to go too deep into defining these policies, but just generally speaking, this is a Postgres feature, so you can go through and do this for any table or anything you want to deal with. And it's pretty important that you make sure you do this in here, but all of this can actually be configured within the editor as well. You can see in here within my configuration of policies, the other policies that I have access to in here, I have select on individual user access and public write access. Those two are coming from right here, and you can look at this policy right here, and I'm basically just saying it's just saying that the auth.uid has to equal the owner in order to select. So that's all we're really doing here. Again, read the documentation to get deeper into it, but that's sort of the gist of it. Now we have our database created and set up and all that stuff, but how are we actually going to work with this? And the way we're going to work with this is we're just going to connect to our database directly. So if we look at our .env file right here, I have my database URL, which is Postgres, blah, 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 blah. So this is just a direct connection to the Postgres instance. So I'm just going to use this like a normal Postgres database. And what are we going to use to interface with our Postgres database? Drizzle. So we go into our source right here and we go into our lib, we go into server. So this is all stuff that can only be executed on the server. We're going to see our drizzle schema. So we go into schema.ts. I have defined all of that here. There are tons of videos going over drizzle and their documentation is amazing. So I'll be sort of brief on this one, but basically all we're doing here is we're just taking everything we wrote within those migrations and we're just copying it over to drizzle and defining it here. I'm setting the ID is a primary key. Within the image group table, it's a serial ID primary key, and then I'm setting it's a timestamp, and then blah, 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 blah. All of this sort of matches, and really there's nothing too crazy here, but the biggest question that I think a lot of people would have is, why am I not utilizing drizzle for the migrations instead of Supabase for the migrations? Why aren't I just defining my schema here and then using drizzle migrate or using Prisma and then Prisma migrate and all that stuff? And I think that's a very valid question, and I think it's something that I'm actually sort of debating with myself right now, is what the best way to do this is. A principle in programming, which I very strongly hold to, is called single source of truth, single point of control. Different people call it different things, but the general idea is everything should have a single source of truth and a single place where everything else is a single place where you can change it and everything else will change as a result. And in this case, I've decided that my point of control is going to be this migrations. This is the source of truth for my database, is this migrations directory, not drizzle. Drizzle follows this, not the other way around. And that's sort of how we structured it here. I'm still thinking about better ways to do this, and if you have suggestions on how you would rather do this, definitely let me know down below. If there are better ways, I'd love to hear them. But that's just how we're doing it here. So all we're doing is we're just matching the values defined within our migrations to drizzle, and then we can now access all of this within our app. So that's super helpful. This db.ts is just going to initialize a client, and it's just going to be a Postgres instance connecting to our database URL. Now, one of the only and current biggest downsides to this is an actual normal Postgres connection, so this cannot run on an edge runtime for now. I think in the future, there are definitely ways we could get around this. I think using the Prisma data proxy and the Prisma edge client, we could do it. You could do it through a variety of different methods, but in this case, just connecting directly to our database, we can't really do anything about that, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. Let's talk about the authentication flow. I went ahead and reset the database and cleared everything out so that we can just do this fresh, and I can show you how all this is working. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and log into the app. So when I hit login or sign up, it'll take me to this page, which just has a sign in with GitHub. So let's go back over to our app. And if we look within our source directory, we go within our roots, we go within login, and within our page.svelte, we can see a couple different things here. First and foremost, we have this load function within our page.server. This is going to check whether or not we're logged in or not. And if we are logged in, it'll send us to the profile page. And the way we check whether or not we're logged in is with this session, this get session. So this get session function is something that we defined within our locals. And basically all it is it's just a simple method to go ahead and check whether or not they're logged in. If they're not logged in, it'll be null. If they are logged in, then we'll have access to the session object from Supabase, which is great. So we're just checking whether or not they're logged in. Then within our page itself, we can go ahead and actually handle the sign-in logic. So this is actually not too horribly difficult to implement. All we have to do is just create this function sign in with GitHub and then use supabase.auth.sign-in with OAuth and then set it to be a provider of GitHub, and then it just works. So the actual code for this is really simple. Now, the setup of this is a little more complex, so we'll talk about that in a second here. But I do want to just call out once again, all the way back from the beginning, remember where this Supabase is coming from is from that original layout.server.ts and that layout.ts. So we're getting Supabase and session from that, and that's allowing us to actually sign the user in here. So I guess this is probably a good time to talk about what was actually happening within all those helper files. So within this layout.server.ts, all we're doing is we're just defining the session. So we're just getting our session and then providing that everywhere we need it. So on all of the different pages, we have access to the session. Great. Next up, we have our layout.ts, which is the universal loader, which can be executed client-side. And this is going to go ahead and create our Supabase load client. And this Supabase load client is a special little helper that's provided to us within the auth helpers for SvelteKit. And basically what this does is this just creates our client-side Supabase instance. So we have Supabase right here, which is a Supabase client, and we're returning that down. And that's what we're going to use to log in the user. And we're also going to get our session here again. We just make sure that all of that is up to date. But one thing you'll notice in here is we have this depends, and this depends is a really useful thing that we can use to basically invalidate a load function and make it run again whenever something changes within our app. So we go into our layout.svelte right here. We're setting up this listener, which is going to on mount. We're going to set up this thing that's going to set that anytime we have an on auth state change, we're going to invalidate Supabase auth, which just means that we are going to run that layout.ts load function again. And the reason we're running that again is because we want to make sure that our session is now null, and then the user will no longer be logged in and they'll get redirected out and we'll rerun all that stuff. So we're just setting up that subscription right here. This is straight out of Supabase's docs. So if you want to get more information on that, I'll have the quick start link down below, but that's basically all we're doing here. It looks a lot scarier than it is. It's basically just saying, hey, if they log out or something, then log them out. That's kind of it. And then we have this logout function, which again, once we have all this stuff set up, it really is just as trivial as supabase.auth.signout. And we're getting that Supabase from our loader. We call it down here. We hit this sign out button and it logs us out. So that's the gist of the code, but how are we actually going to make this OAuth work? So if you're not familiar with social logins, there is typically some stuff that you have to provide to actually get those to work. So in order to set up social logins like this, we have to get some credentials from the social provider. In this case, we're using GitHub because it's one of the easiest ones. And within the Supabase documentation, they have full examples and breakdowns on how to do this for every single different provider. But today I'm just going to be showing you how to do this within GitHub. So within GitHub, it's really, really easy. All you have to do is just create a little application. So you go within your developer settings, you hit new OAuth app, you go in here, give it a name, give it a URL, and then you just have to give it this callback URL. And the callback URL is really the most important part of all of this because that does have to match with what you define or else it won't work. So we go in here. So this Enceladus1 local is what I define to get this working. And I have all this stuff in here. I have my client secrets, which you can generate in here. And then those are what will get put into your .env file. If we look within our .env.example, GitHub client ID and GitHub secret, that comes from right here. And then my callback URL is going to be localhost 54321/auth/v1/callback. Now you'll notice when we go to our actual app right here, that's not the same local host that we're talking about here. The local host we're talking about here is 5173. But the reason why we're doing that is because we're doing this through the local Supabase instance. So if I run Supabase status, we go in here and we can see my API URL is going to be localhost 54321. So if you use this in production, if we read their documentation right here, it'll say the callback URL is going to be this https project-ref supabase.co/auth/v1/callback. In this case, since we're running the local instance, it's just going to be localhost 54321 getting the authentication thing. So we're not actually redirecting them to our app. We're redirecting them to the Supabase server. instance, because that's how you exchange all of it. That's how you log them in, and they handle everything behind the scenes. I don't have a full understanding of how all that stuff works, and you don't need to, because all you need to know is that they call back there and then they get logged in on your app, which is awesome. So that's how we're handling that right here. But there's one more thing we need to set up, and that's going to be our actual config within the app. So if you were doing this online, you'd have to do some stuff within the Supabase dashboard. But since we're doing things locally, if you go into your config.toml within your Supabase directory, you'll see in here, and I've already configured all of this within the example project, so you just need to socket your envs in and it'll work. But if you're going to do this on your own with a new project or a new provider, you'd have to set this up. So you can see we have this giant hard to read file. It's pretty overwhelming, but there's really only one sort of section that matters, and that's going to be our auth.external.github. So first and foremost, we need to enable it, and then we need to set our client ID and our secret to be an environment variable. So Supabase within this config will allow you to put env and then parentheses and environment variables so that you can use these within this file and you don't have to commit them to CI/CD. I don't have to put my special client secrets and all that stuff within a .env within my actual project and commit those to GitHub. I can just use environment variables, which is really, really nice. That's how they should do it. So that's all we had to set there. And then the last thing I did change is I just set my site URL to be localhost 5173. By default, this will be localhost 3000 because that's what most frameworks use, but Svelte wanted to be cute and they decided that 5173 would be their port for some reason. I don't know why, but they did, and it's fine. So we have to change that up here, make sure that that's an allowed redirect URL, and then we're good. So all this actually looks like in the actual app is we go back to our Enceladus 1 page, our login. I hit sign in with GitHub, and that is going to execute, if you remember, and that is going to execute the supabase.auth.signin with OAuth, provider of GitHub. We hit this button, sign in with GitHub, and we're right back here. We have everything we need. We are logged into our app. And now if we go back here, we can go to our dashboard page and it's going to redirect us to the profile page. So remember in that diagram earlier, I said that there's going to be a check where it's like, okay, if they have a profile, we need to send them here. If they don't have a profile, we need to send them there. In this case, they don't have a profile, so we need to create one. I'm going to go ahead in here and I'm going to create my profile. So I'm just going to say Ben Davis. And if we look within our database right here, we can see that in our table, the profile page, nothing is in here. And this is going to create our profile. But let me show you the code behind this first. So if we go to the profile root, we have our page.svelte, and there's really nothing special in here. This is just a form and some HTML. Literally, our script tag is empty. But if we go to our page.server.ts, this is where things get interesting. So far we've only been looking at load functions. We haven't really gone into any of the actions yet, but here we do need to run an action. So the action we're going to be running here is going to be to create the user. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to get the first name and the last name from the form data. So these are form actions. And if you look at our client-side code here, there's no JavaScript, there's no use state, there's no defining a React hook form or anything like that. I just have HTML forms where I'm defining that the name of this input is going to be first name, name of this input is going to be last name, and they're all within this semantic HTML form. And the key to all of this is this method post action create. So I'm saying that we're going to make a post request to !/create, which is going to make a post request or a server action or a form action request to this create action on my server. So on my server, I can get the first name, I can get the last name, make sure that they're there, and then we can go ahead and create our server. And this is where we get into some actual logic. So we're going to grab our session from get session, make sure it's there. If they're not logged in, obviously you can't create a profile if you're not logged in, but if they are logged in, we're going to go ahead and just insert into our database. If you haven't used Drizzle before, Drizzle is one of my favorite ORMs because it's super, super close to SQL. And if you look at this query, it's pretty freaking close to SQL. We're just doing db.insert. We're inserting into the profile table. We're setting our values that we're inserting to be a user ID of the session.user.id. Remember that foreign key constraint we created earlier where remember that foreign key constraint we started way at the beginning of the app where we had auth.users, the user ID references auth.users. That what it's referencing is the session.user ID, the user ID, which is great. We have access to that here. We can set that. We just set our first name, set our last name, and then set our email. All this stuff is done. Then we're going to redirect them to the dashboard. So let's go ahead and actually do that. Let's say Ben Davis, and then sign up. Bang, it worked. So now we're on our dashboard page. We're all logged in. We're all set, and we can go ahead and create some images. Check our profile table. Bang, right there. Everything worked. Now let's talk about the fun part of this. Let's actually generate an image. So all we need to do to generate an image is go to generate a new group. And if we go in here, we can go ahead and create a new image. So all we have to do is enter our prompt, and I'll do that later, but let's take a look at what the actual code for this is going to be. So if we look at our generate page, once again, we have a big server action here, and that's going to be new. The page.svelte is unbelievably trivial. Again, it's the exact same thing that we did within the other one with one minor difference. So what we did in here is we set up a sort of loading state, because since we're making an external API call to OpenAI and we're generating an image, that can take a few seconds. It'll often take like 5-6 seconds or so. So I don't want the user to just like freeze the app. I want them to get a visual indicator that it's loading. So I'm going to use this use enhance directive, which is basically just going to be whenever we submit this form, this function will call. So whenever we submit the form, I'm just going to set is loading to be true. State within Svelte is just beautiful. Just is loading equals false, then is loading equals true, and it just works the way you'd expect. Beautiful stuff. And then down here, we just have two different buttons. We have, if it's not loading, then we have our generate button, which will submit it. And then if it is loading, then we just have a disabled button that just says loading. Pretty simple stuff. So that's all there is to the client, but the server, this is really where kind of the meat of the app happens. So let's just go through this line by line. First and foremost, get the session. If they're not logged in, send them away. Next up, we need to get the profile. Again, remember earlier we said we need to check and make sure they've got a profile because we need to attach this image to something. So we're going to go ahead and here into our profile, and we're going to do a db.select from the profile table where the user ID equals where the profile table user ID equals the session.user ID. Make sure that all that stuff exists and that we just have access to the profile because we're going to need this later. So now that we've done that, we can go ahead and get our prompt from the form data. Super basic stuff on the client. We're just setting the prompt to be a string. The prompt is coming from that text area. Really basic stuff here. We just have our prompt. And now this is where things get interesting. We need to generate our image. So we're going to be using the OpenAI API to generate this. This isn't an Open API tutorial because there's no real reason to go too deep into that. But if you want to learn more about that, I'll have the documentation for it below. And if you want to get your own API key, I also have the documentation for that down below. Basically, all this is going to do is we're going to make a request to their image generations API, and we're going to create one 512 by 512 image that matches the prompt that was provided by the user. Pretty simple stuff, but now we need to wait for the response. So the response is going to be of the shape of, it's going to have a created, which is going to be a time code, and then data, which is going to be an array of the images that we got. So we just wait for that, make sure that we got that in here. I printed that out for debugging. I'll delete that. Whoops. And now we need to save the images. So first and foremost, we want to make sure, okay, did we actually get some images? If we did, great. Next thing we need to do is actually get the image blob. So we're using Supabase storage to keep these images on our server. We did all the setup for that earlier within our database migration. So now it's as trivial as just using the Supabase SDK to insert them into our database, insert them into our storage buckets. So what we're doing here is we're making a fetch request to the URL that was passed down. We get that response, and now we're going to grab the image blob, which is just external response.blob. We grab the blob of the image, and then now we can save this into our storage bucket. First things first, get an ID for the image. We need some unique identifier. Next thing is we need to set the path for the image. I'm storing all my stuff within, each user gets their own folder to organize this on the back end. I'm going to say the image path is going to be the user's profile ID / image ID. This is just normal file system type stuff. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to create the actual files. We're going to create a new JavaScript file object. So we pass in the image blob, the image ID, and then the type. So we just know what the file type of the image blob was. And then now, finally, after all that nonsense, we can save it to our database. We can go ahead, event.locals.supabase.storage. We're going to say .from, and that's just picking which bucket we want. Remember, we defined the ID of the bucket to be generated underscore images within our migrations. If we go into the migrations directory, you can see right here, it's generated images is the ID, and that's the same ID that we're going to be using right here within our generate function. Then we're going to upload. The name is going to be the image path, and then the file is just the file. After all of that is finally done, we can finally insert this into our database. Now, there's an extra layer of complexity because there was a feature that I was thinking about implementing, but ultimately just ran out of time, so I didn't fully implement. But that's image groups. So the sort of idea would be like you could have a group of images and you could like optimize the images and that kind of thing. Maybe we'll do a follow-up video on how to update an app like this and how creating new migrations could work or that kind of thing. That could be cool. But in this case, all we're doing is our sort of data structures. We have groups of images, and then underneath those groups of images, we just have actual images. So first thing we need to do is create a new group of images. We're going to just insert into the image group table, and we're just going to set that the owner ID is going to be the profile ID, and then that's it. The biggest thing we need to get here is we need to get the inserted ID from this .returning function. This is super close to SQL, so really nice stuff here from Drizzle. We get the inserted ID, and then now we can go ahead and insert into the image table. So now within the image table, we're going to go ahead and we're going to set the value to be the image path. We're going to set the query to be the prompt so that we can persist that so that we know what we actually asked for the image. And then we're going to set the group ID to be the new group ID, 0 entry to be the inserted ID. So remember, we got that from here. And with all of that stuff done, we've created our image. There was a lot to go over here, and I highly recommend that you go through this code yourself. But, you know, there's a lot here, but it's really not as complex as you'd probably think. It's just some weird stuff with files and some weird stuff with inserting. But after all that's done, we can go ahead and redirect to the details page, which on the details page, all we're going to do is we're going to fetch that image and then display it out to the end user. We'll talk about that in a moment. But let me show you this in action. So we go in here, we will say a blue car driving across a large bridge. Seems like a decent image idea. Again, it takes a minute to load, and most of that time loading is going to be spent within the OpenAI call because it just takes a minute to generate these images. And now here we have it. This very cursed image of a weird looking car driving across a slightly uncanny bridge. Great. AI, yeah, there you go. It works. And now let's talk about the detail page. So all we're going to do here is we're just going to print out a bunch of images, really basic stuff coming from our database. So the biggest thing we're doing is from this export let data, we're going to get our groups and we're going to get our image URLs. So remember, so as we've done for everything else, let's go to our page.server and let's load some data. So the first thing we're going to do is grab the image table things. I have a to-do in here of like double checking and ensuring that they own everything that they're fetching. That's just a thing that you can add later in. We were kind of lazy about that here, but we just went ahead and we went into the DB. So we're going to go ahead in here and we're going to just query from our image group table. Now you're going to notice right here, this is a little different syntax from normal Drizzle. And this is actually a really cool thing that I didn't even know Drizzle could do, which is pretty awesome, is they have a Prisma-like syntax that we can use that makes relational queries a heck of a lot easier. We don't have to worry about joins and doing all that stuff. We can just use this with directive and get our groups the way we would probably want them to be fetched. So you can see the return of this is going to be a group, it's going to have an ID, all this stuff, and then it'll have an array of images attached to that group, which is super awesome. This is how I like querying databases. I'm a Prisma guy. So what we did in here is we just set our where to be the group ID equals the event.params.id, because remember the detail page is going to be detail/1. So we're going to be getting the details of the group with an ID of 1. So we fetch all that stuff, get all that stuff, make sure that they're found. And then finally, we can set up our image URLs. So this is a pretty common thing that often you have to do is you get some stuff from a database and then you have to transform it. I've found myself doing that all the time. I'm just defining, okay, my image URLs need to have a query, a value, and a created at, because that's what we need to display to the user. And then we're just going to go through and we're going to loop through all these images. We're going to say, all right, the image is going to be group.images_i. just makes it easier semantically. We're going to set our public URL, and this public URL is going to come from the Supabase SDK. We're going to do event.locals.supabase, remember where that came from way back when, .storage.from generated images, just like when we inserted them, and then we're going to create a signed URL using the image.value, which is going to be the key effectively, and then we're going to say that it lasts for 60,000, I believe that's milliseconds. Number of seconds. So yeah, it's going to expire in a long time, but that's all we're doing here. We're creating a signed URL, and that signed URL will just allow us to view it on the client. So we'll double check here that there's no error. If there is an error, we just don't push anything, but if there isn't an error, we go ahead and we push this in. We set up our query to be image.query value, created at basic stuff, and then we're returning these to the user. We're printing them out here. So again, really not too difficult of stuff. Just kind of need to make sure that you have a decent understanding of what's sort of going on with all these different pieces. And the thing that I'm really trying to hammer home here is where everything's coming from. The actual business logic is not hard here, but understanding where this event.locals.supabase comes from is really important. Understanding where generated images this ID comes from is important. Understanding all that stuff is critical, because once you understand that stuff, everything else becomes kind of trivial, because then it's just solving a problem with tools that you understand. The problem solving becomes really hard when you don't understand the tools you're working with. So that's what I'm really trying to hammer home here. So that's the sort of high level of the app. I guess the last page we didn't really talk about would be the dashboard page. But again, this is just a load function that makes sure that the user is logged in, grabs their profile, grabs their groups, and sends them down. If we look at our dashboard page, that's all we're looking at here. We just have a group with ID of 1, click on it, we go back to this page. Nothing too special there. But this is kind of a good example of what a fully featured app could look like with Supabase and SvelteKit. This has most of the concepts that you would need, and hopefully this is useful for you guys to sort of learn how this is working. And I think if you're trying to do more with this, I recommend reading the docs, and also I recommend going through and maybe trying to add something to this. Try and add on the image optimization features, or add in something completely different. I don't care. Just mess with it a little more and see how all this stuff works together, because the best way to learn it is to do it. And that's the app. I'm going to be doing deployment in a separate video because there's a lot of nuances to it and a lot of setup that I don't think really fits in here. So we'll be talking about that in more detail in a video coming very soon, but I hope you guys enjoyed this. I would love feedback on how this sort of went and worked for you guys. I know that it's sort of a different structure than a lot of tutorial type things, but hopefully it was helpful. Supabase and SvelteKit are both amazing, and if you enjoyed this, make sure you subscribe, join the Discord, we have a link down below, and I will hopefully talk to you very soon. Have a good one.